The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as Lady Victoria Ashworth stepped out of her silver luxury vehicle, her heels clicking against the wet pavement with practiced precision. She had been queen consort for 3 years now, yet every entrance into the palace still felt like walking into a fortress where she remained an outsider. The ornate gates loomed before her, symbols of centuries of tradition that seemed to whisper reminders of her relatively humble beginnings as the daughter of a successful businessman rather than born nobility. Captain James Morrison stood at attention near the main entrance, his uniform immaculate despite the early hour. At 42, he had dedicated nearly 2 decades of his life to protecting the royal family, earning his position through unwavering loyalty and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate threats before they materialized. His sharp blue eyes tracked every movement in the courtyard, a habit so ingrained that he continued the surveillance even during routine arrivals. Victoria's personal assistant hurried ahead, but she moved at her own measured pace, aware that dozens of staff members were watching from various windows and doorways. The palace operated like a small city, with hundreds of employees whose livelihood depended on the smooth functioning of the monarchy. Every gesture, every expression, every choice of clothing was analyzed and discussed in the servant quarters, then potentially leaked to the ever-hungry press. As she approached the entrance, Captain Morrison stepped forward with a slight bow. His expression remained professionally neutral, but Victoria caught something in his eyes that made her pause. In her 3 years as queen consort, she had learned to read the subtle language of palace life, where direct communication was often impossible and important information was conveyed through glances, gestures, and carefully chosen words. The captain's usual morning greeting was absent. Instead, he simply said, "Your Majesty, if I might request a moment of your time before you proceed inside." His voice carried the weight of someone who rarely asked for anything, making the request all the more significant. Victoria glanced around the courtyard, noting the presence of several other guards and staff members within earshot. "Of course, Captain Morrison. Perhaps we could speak in the Blue Drawing Room?" The Blue Drawing Room was one of the smaller, more private spaces where sensitive conversations could take place without the risk of being overheard by the extensive palace staff. As they walked through the familiar corridors lined with portraits of long-dead monarchs, Victoria's mind raced through possible scenarios. Had there been a security threat? Was there some protocol she had unknowingly violated? The palace operated according to rules that stretched back centuries, many of them unwritten but no less important for their informal nature. Captain Morrison's military bearing never wavered, but Victoria had spent enough time around him to notice the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested closer to his radio than usual. Whatever he needed to discuss was serious enough to risk breaching the normal chain of command, which typically required him to report concerns to the king's private secretary first. The Blue Drawing Room was empty when they arrived, morning sunlight filtering through tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens. Victoria settled into one of the elegant chairs while Captain Morrison remained standing, his training preventing him from sitting in the presence of royalty without explicit permission. "Captain Morrison, you seem troubled this morning. Please, speak freely." Victoria had learned that encouraging directness often yielded better results than dancing around sensitive topics, though she knew that even her invitation wouldn't completely overcome years of protocol training. The captain took a deep breath before responding. "Your Majesty, I've received some concerning reports from the security team regarding yesterday's events. There was an incident involving your vehicle and some irregularities in the planned route that have raised questions about security protocols." Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Yesterday had been routine as far as she knew, a series of engagements in London followed by the drive back to the palace. She tried to recall any unusual moments, any deviations from the normal routine that might have attracted attention. "I'm afraid I don't understand, Captain. Yesterday seemed perfectly normal to me. Could you be more specific about these irregularities?" She kept her voice steady, though her heart rate had increased. In the world of royalty, even minor protocol violations could escalate into major scandals if they reached the wrong ears. Captain Morrison's expression remained carefully controlled, but Victoria could see the conflict in his eyes. He was clearly struggling with how much to reveal, balancing his duty to protect the royal family with his obligation to maintain security protocols. "Your Majesty, there are concerns about the route your driver took through the city. It deviated significantly from the approved security plan, and there were interactions with members of the public that weren't part of the scheduled itinerary." His words were carefully chosen, But Victoria could sense there was much more to the story. The implications began to sink in. Any unplanned interactions with the public represented potential security risks, but they also represented opportunities for negative publicity if things had gone wrong. The British press was always eager for stories about royal misconduct or security failures. Captain Morrison, I need you to be completely honest with me about what happened. If there's going to be fallout from this, I need to understand the full scope of the situation before it reaches the king or the press. Victoria's voice carried the authority that came with her position, but also a note of genuine concern. The captain glanced toward the closed door, then back to Victoria. Your Majesty, your driver took an unscheduled stop at a private residence in Kensington. The security detail wasn't given advance notice, and there were civilians present who weren't part of any approved guest list. The entire incident lasted approximately 30 minutes. Victoria's mind immediately went to her friend Margaret Thornton, who lived in Kensington and had been going through a difficult divorce. Had she made an impulsive decision to visit her friend? The previous day felt like a blur of official engagements, but she tried to remember if there had been any spontaneous decisions. Did anyone document this visit? Were there photographs taken? The questions came quickly as Victoria began to understand the potential implications. An unscheduled visit to a private residence could be spun in numerous negative ways by the press, especially if they didn't have the full context. Captain Morrison's hesitation told her everything she needed to know before he spoke. There were civilians present with mobile phones, Your Majesty, and the residence in question belongs to someone who has recently been in the news regarding legal proceedings. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Margaret's divorce had indeed been covered in the tabloids, particularly because her husband was a prominent businessman with connections to several political figures. An unplanned visit from the Queen Consort to someone embroiled in a public scandal would be exactly the kind of story the press would seize upon. How long do we have before this becomes public knowledge? Victoria asked, already knowing that damage control would need to begin immediately. It's difficult to say, Your Majesty. If someone captured clear photographs and chooses to sell them to the papers, we could see stories as early as this afternoon's editions. The security footage from the street cameras in that area is also being reviewed by various agencies as part of routine monitoring. Victoria stood and walked to the window, looking out at the perfectly manicured gardens where tourists would soon gather hoping for a glimpse of royal life. The irony wasn't lost on her that her position required her to be simultaneously completely public and entirely private, available to her subjects while maintaining an almost impossible standard of behavior. Captain Morrison, what would you recommend as our next course of action? She had learned that the security team often had valuable insights into managing potential crises, given their experience with past incidents and their understanding of how information flowed both within and outside the palace walls. The captain joined her near the window, maintaining a respectful distance while lowering his voice. Your Majesty, I believe the king should be informed immediately before he hears about this from other sources. The Lord Chancellor will also need to be briefed so that the communications team can prepare appropriate responses if questions arise. Victoria nodded, knowing he was right, but dreading the conversation with her husband. King Edward had been dealing with his own pressures lately, including ongoing tensions with his daughter Princess Charlotte, who had never fully accepted Victoria's place in the family. Adding another potential scandal to his concerns seemed almost cruel. There's something else, Your Majesty, Captain Morrison continued, his voice even more carefully modulated. The security review has raised questions about the decision-making process for your personal protection detail. There may be recommendations for changes to current protocols. This was the part Victoria had been dreading. Changes to security protocols often meant restrictions on personal freedom, additional oversight, and sometimes changes in personnel. She had worked hard to develop good relationships with her current security team, and the thought of starting over with new people was exhausting. What kind of changes are being considered? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Enhanced advance planning requirements for all travel, mandatory security briefings for any deviation from approved routes, and possibly additional personnel for certain types of engagements. Captain Morrison's tone suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with all of the proposed changes, but he was duty-bound to relay them accurately. Victoria felt the familiar weight of her position settling around her like a heavy cloak. Every decision she made had consequences not just for herself, but for the institution of the monarchy, for her husband's reign, and for the hundreds of people whose jobs depended on the royal family maintaining their reputation and relevance. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside reminded both of them that the palace was fully awakening to another day of scheduled activities, meetings, and obligations. Victoria's morning calendar was already full, with a charity luncheon, a meeting with her patronage's coordinator, and a briefing on upcoming state visits. Captain Morrison, I want you to know that I appreciate your discretion in bringing this matter to my attention privately. Whatever mistakes may have been made yesterday, they weren't intentional, and I don't want them to reflect poorly on any members of the security team who were simply following my directions. The captain's expression softened slightly at this acknowledgement. Thank you, Your Majesty. The team is completely loyal to you and to the crown. We all want to find the best path forward. As they prepared to leave the blue drawing room, Victoria realized that this conversation marked a turning point. The relative freedom she had enjoyed during her first 3 years as queen consort was about to be curtailed, and the scrutiny she faced would likely intensify. But, perhaps more importantly, she would need to have some difficult conversations with her husband and stepdaughter about the challenges of maintaining family relationships while living under the constant pressure of public expectations. The morning sun had fully emerged by the time they returned to the main corridor, where staff members continued their daily routines, unaware of the potential crisis being managed just feet away from them. Victoria straightened her shoulders and prepared to face whatever the day might bring, knowing that her response to this situation would set the tone for how future challenges would be handled. King Edward was reviewing correspondence in his private study when Victoria knocked on the familiar oak door. The room had been his sanctuary for over a decade, lined with books, family photographs, and artifacts from his travels before ascending to the throne. The morning light filtering through tall windows created a peaceful atmosphere that belied the tension Victoria knew her news would bring to the space. "Come in, my dear," Edward called, not looking up from the papers spread across his mahogany desk. At 58, he had grown into his role as monarch, but the weight of constant decision-making had added silver to his temples and lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when they first met. Victoria closed the door behind her and approached the desk where her husband was signing what appeared to be official documents. She had learned to recognize his different types of concentration, and this morning he seemed particularly focused on whatever required his attention. "Edward, I need to speak with you about something rather urgent that's come to light this morning." Her voice carried enough gravity to make him look up immediately, his pen freezing mid-signature. "That sounds ominous. Please, sit down and tell me what's happened." He gestured to the comfortable chair across from his desk, the same chair where they had shared countless conversations about the challenges and rewards of their unique life together. Victoria settled into the chair and tried to organize her thoughts. She had been rehearsing this conversation during the walk from the blue drawing room, but now that the moment had arrived, finding the right words seemed more difficult than she had anticipated. "Yesterday's engagements may have created a security concern," she began, choosing her words carefully. "Captain Morrison informed me this morning that my vehicle made an unscheduled stop that wasn't part of the approved itinerary, and there may be documentation of this deviation that could become public." Edward's expression immediately shifted to what Victoria had come to recognize as his crisis management mode. Years of dealing with various royal scandals and public relations challenges had taught him to compartmentalize emotional reactions in favor of practical problem-solving. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said, setting aside his correspondence entirely and giving her his full attention. Victoria explained the visit to Margaret Thornton's residence, the security concerns that had been raised, and the possibility that photographs or video evidence might exist. She watched as Edward's expression grew more serious with each detail, knowing that he was already calculating the potential impact on the monarchy's reputation. "How long have you known Margaret Thornton, and what is her current situation?" Edward asked, demonstrating his ability to quickly identify the most important aspects of any potential scandal. "We've been friends for about 8 years. She's going through a rather public divorce from Jonathan Thornton, the property developer. It's been covered in the tabloids because of some financial irregularities in his business dealings." Victoria knew that Edward would immediately understand the implications of a royal connection to anyone involved in financial scandals. Edward leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in a gesture Victoria recognized as his thinking pose. "The timing couldn't be worse. We're already dealing with budget questions from Parliament, and Charlotte's recent comments to the press about modernizing the monarchy have created some tension with the traditionalist factions." The mention of Princess Charlotte brought another layer of complexity to the situation. Edward's 28-year-old daughter had been increasingly vocal about her belief that the royal family needed to become more accessible and less formal, views that often put her at odds with established protocol and, by extension, with Victoria's more traditional approach to royal duties. Has Charlotte been briefed on this situation yet? Victoria asked, knowing that the princess often heard palace gossip through her own network of contacts among the younger staff members. Not yet, but she'll need to know before this goes any further. She's scheduled to attend the Youth Leadership Summit this afternoon, and if there are questions from the press about family matters, she'll need to be prepared. Edward's tone suggested he wasn't looking forward to that conversation any more than Victoria had enjoyed her discussion with Captain Morrison. A knock on the study door interrupted their conversation. Edward's private secretary entered with a grave expression that immediately told them both that the situation had evolved beyond their control. "Your Majesty, I apologize for the interruption, but Lord Chancellor Pierce is requesting an immediate audience. He says it's regarding a matter of urgent security concern." The secretary's carefully neutral tone couldn't disguise the fact that this was not a routine request. Edward and Victoria exchanged glances, both understanding that their private discussion time had just ended. "Send him in immediately," Edward replied, rising from his chair as Victoria did the same. Lord Chancellor William Pierce entered the study with the measured stride of someone who had delivered unwelcome news to royalty many times over his 30-year career in palace administration. At 65, he had served 3 monarchs and had developed a reputation for managing crises with calm efficiency and brutal honesty. "Your Majesties," he began with a slight bow, "I'm afraid we have a developing situation that requires immediate attention. The Communications Department has received inquiries from 3 major publications regarding photographs allegedly showing Her Majesty at an undisclosed location yesterday afternoon." Victoria felt her stomach drop, but she maintained her composure while Edward stepped closer to his longtime advisor. The speed at which the story was developing suggested that someone had deliberately chosen to sell the photographs rather than simply posting them on social media. "What exactly are we dealing with, William?" Edward asked, using the informal address that indicated he wanted complete honesty without diplomatic cushioning. Lord Chancellor Pierce opened the leather portfolio he had been carrying and extracted several printed photographs. These images were taken by a neighbor of Mrs. Margaret Thornton using a telephoto lens from an upper-floor window. They clearly show Her Majesty entering and leaving the residence, as well as what appears to be an animated conversation in the garden. Victoria looked at the photographs and immediately remembered the moment they captured. Margaret had been upset about something her lawyer had told her, and Victoria had been trying to provide comfort and advice. From the camera's perspective, however, the body language could easily be misinterpreted as an argument or confrontation. "How much do the publications know about Mrs. Thornton's current legal situation?" Edward asked, demonstrating his understanding that the context surrounding the visit was as important as the visit itself. "They know everything that's been reported publicly about her divorce proceedings, plus they've apparently done additional research into her husband's business connections. There are suggestions that this wasn't a social call, but rather some kind of intervention or discussion related to the legal proceedings." The implications were staggering. If the press chose to frame Victoria's visit as somehow related to Jonathan Thornton's business dealings or the divorce proceedings, it could suggest that the royal family was taking sides in private legal matters or, worse, potentially influencing legal outcomes through personal relationships. Edward turned to Victoria with a look that wasn't accusatory, but clearly sought clarification. "Victoria, I need you to tell me exactly what you and Margaret discussed yesterday. Everything, no matter how personal or seemingly irrelevant." Victoria took a deep breath and recounted the conversation as accurately as she could remember. Margaret had been worried about her children's emotional well-being during the divorce proceedings, concerned about maintaining their financial security, and frustrated with her legal team's inability to resolve matters more quickly. Victoria had offered emotional support and suggested some resources for counseling services that worked with families in transition. There was no discussion of the business aspects of the divorce, and I certainly didn't offer any advice about legal strategy, Victoria concluded. It was simply one friend supporting another during a difficult time. Lord Chancellor Pierce nodded thoughtfully. "That's helpful for crafting our response, but we need to consider how this will be perceived regardless of the actual facts. The optics of a private visit during an ongoing legal matter involving public figures are problematic. Edward walked to the window overlooking the palace grounds, where early tourists were already gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony. What are our options for managing this situation before it becomes a full-scale media frenzy? We have several approaches to consider, Pierce replied, consulting his notes. We can provide a brief statement confirming that Her Majesty made a personal visit to support a longtime friend during a difficult period, emphasizing the purely personal nature of the relationship and visit. We can also proactively release additional information about Her Majesty's schedule yesterday to demonstrate that this was clearly separate from any official duties. Victoria appreciated the Lord Chancellor's tactical thinking, but she also understood that any official statement would likely generate more questions than it answered. What about simply refusing to comment on private matters? Hasn't that been the palace's traditional approach to personal relationships? Traditionally, yes, but the current media environment is less respectful of those boundaries, Pierce explained. A no-comment response might be interpreted as confirmation that there was something inappropriate about the visit. The conversation was interrupted by Edward's private telephone, which rarely rang during morning meetings unless there was an emergency. His expression grew even more serious as he listened to the caller, occasionally asking brief, clarifying questions. That was the palace press secretary, he announced after ending the call. The photographs have been offered to multiple outlets, and at least one major newspaper is planning to run the story in tomorrow's edition. We have approximately 18 hours to get ahead of this before it becomes front-page news. The time pressure added a new dimension to their decision-making process. With limited time to craft a comprehensive response, they would need to choose their strategy quickly and execute it flawlessly to minimize damage to the monarchy's reputation. Lord Chancellor Pierce gathered the photographs and returned them to his portfolio. I recommend we schedule an emergency meeting with the full communications team within the hour. We'll need to coordinate our response across all channels and prepare for follow-up questions from both the domestic and international press. As the meeting concluded and plans were set in motion for damage control, Victoria realized that her impulsive decision to comfort a friend in distress had created exactly the kind of situation that royal protocol was designed to prevent. The challenge now would be managing the crisis without destroying the personal relationships that made the isolation of royal life bearable. Princess Charlotte was reviewing notes for her afternoon engagement when her personal assistant entered her apartment at Kensington Palace with an expression that immediately signaled trouble. The spacious rooms, decorated in a contemporary style that reflected Charlotte's generation's approach to royal living, suddenly felt smaller as the weight of unwelcome news filled the space. Your Royal Highness, your father has requested your presence at Buckingham Palace for an urgent family meeting. He's asked that you clear your afternoon schedule and come immediately. The assistant's voice carried the kind of careful neutrality that palace staff used when delivering information they weren't authorized to explain. Charlotte closed her laptop and considered the implications. Urgent family meetings were rare and usually signaled either a health crisis or a public relations emergency. Given that she had spoken with her father just 2 days earlier and everyone seemed to be in good health, she suspected this fell into the latter category. Did he indicate what this concerns? She asked, though she knew her assistant probably hadn't been given additional details. Information flow within the royal household was carefully controlled, with different staff members having access to different levels of sensitive information. I'm sorry, Your Royal Highness, but I wasn't given any additional details. Your father's secretary simply emphasized that your presence was requested as soon as possible. Charlotte gathered her things and prepared for the drive across London, her mind racing through possible scenarios. Her relationship with her stepmother had been cordial but distant, built more on mutual respect than genuine warmth. Victoria had made efforts to include Charlotte in family activities, but the 25-year age gap and vastly different perspectives on royal duties had limited their common ground. During the 30-minute drive through London traffic, Charlotte found herself thinking about recent conversations she had had with friends outside the royal circle about the pressures of modern monarchy. Her generation's approach to public service emphasized authenticity and accessibility, values that sometimes conflicted with traditional royal protocol, and the kind of careful image management that had sustained the monarchy for centuries. Buckingham Palace appeared busier than usual when Charlotte arrived, with additional security personnel visible and an unusual number of staff members moving purposefully through the corridors. The atmosphere felt charged with the kind of tension that accompanied significant events, whether celebratory or crisis-oriented. She was escorted directly to her father's private study, where she found King Edward, Victoria, and Lord Chancellor Pierce engaged in what was clearly a serious discussion. The formality of their positioning around the room and the presence of the Lord Chancellor immediately told Charlotte that whatever had prompted this meeting was significant. "Charlotte, thank you for coming so quickly," her father said, rising from behind his desk. "We have a developing situation that may affect the family, and I wanted you to understand the circumstances before you hear about them from other sources." Charlotte took the offered seat and prepared herself for whatever revelation was about to be shared. She had grown up understanding that being born into the royal family meant that personal matters could become public crises with little warning, but she had hoped that her adult years might offer more control over such situations. Victoria spoke first, her voice steady but clearly strained by the morning's events. "Charlotte, yesterday I made an unplanned visit to a friend who was dealing with some personal difficulties. Unfortunately, this visit was photographed by a neighbor, and those photographs are going to be published in tomorrow's newspapers." The basic facts seemed relatively minor to Charlotte, who had grown up with constant media attention and understood that royal family members were photographed constantly. "I'm not sure I understand why this particular visit would be newsworthy," she said, looking between the adults for clarification. Lord Chancellor Pierce opened his portfolio and showed Charlotte the photographs, explaining the context of Margaret Thornton's divorce proceedings and the potential implications of a royal visit during ongoing legal matters. As he spoke, Charlotte began to understand the complexity of the situation. So the concern is that Victoria's visit could be interpreted as the royal family taking sides in a legal dispute, or potentially influencing the outcome of divorce proceedings? Charlotte asked, demonstrating her understanding of how royal actions could be misinterpreted in the public sphere. "Exactly," her father confirmed. "Even though the visit was purely personal and motivated by friendship, the optics create potential problems for the monarchy's reputation for neutrality in private legal matters." Charlotte studied the photographs more carefully, noting the apparent intensity of the conversation captured by the telephoto lens. She could see how the images might be used to support various narratives, depending on the editorial perspective of whichever publication chose to run them. "What's our planned response?" she asked, automatically including herself in the crisis management process despite not being directly involved in the original situation. Victoria looked surprised by Charlotte's immediate acceptance of shared responsibility, perhaps expecting criticism or judgment about the decision to make the unplanned visit. "We're still evaluating our options. The communications team is preparing several possible statements, depending on how the story is initially framed." Charlotte leaned back in her chair and considered the situation from multiple angles. Her generation's approach to crisis management often involved more transparency and directness than traditional royal public relations strategies, but she understood that different situations required different approaches. "Has anyone considered the possibility of getting ahead of this story by proactively discussing the importance of maintaining personal relationships despite public responsibilities?" she suggested. "Rather than being defensive about the visit, we could frame it as an example of how royal family members remain connected to real people facing real challenges." The suggestion clearly hadn't been considered, and Charlotte could see the adults in the room processing this alternative perspective. Lord Chancellor Pierce made notes while Victoria and Edward exchanged glances that suggested they were intrigued by the possibility. "That's an interesting approach," Pierce acknowledged, "but it would require us to discuss Mrs. Thornton's situation more publicly than might be comfortable for her or appropriate given the ongoing legal proceedings." Charlotte nodded, understanding the complication. "What if we focused on the general principle without discussing the specific details? People understand that royal family members have friendships and personal relationships. Making this about supporting friends during difficult times, rather than about any particular legal situation, might resonate more positively with the public." Her father seemed genuinely impressed by this perspective. "Charlotte, that's actually quite insightful. It reframes the narrative around relatable human values rather than protocol violations." Victoria turned to Charlotte with an expression of gratitude that surprised them both. "I appreciate your willingness to help find a constructive path forward. I know this situation could reflect poorly on the entire family, and I don't want my personal decisions to create problems for you or your father." This moment of vulnerability from Victoria prompted Charlotte to reconsider some of her assumptions about her stepmother. Perhaps the careful distance she had maintained was based more on her own preconceptions than on Victoria's actual character or intentions. "Victoria, we're family," Charlotte said simply. "When one of us faces challenges, we all do. That's both the burden and the privilege of our position. Lord Chancellor Pierce cleared his throat, bringing their attention back to the immediate practical concerns. If we're going to pursue this reframing approach, we'll need to coordinate very carefully with the communications team. The messaging will need to be consistent across all platforms and spokespersons. Edward walked to his desk and picked up the telephone. I'm going to call an expanded strategy meeting for within the hour. Charlotte, I'd like you to participate if you're willing. Your perspective on how this situation might be received by younger audiences could be valuable. Charlotte agreed readily, realizing that this crisis was providing an unexpected opportunity for her to contribute meaningfully to family decision-making in a way that hadn't happened before. Her suggestions were being taken seriously, and her insights were valued rather than dismissed as generational naivety. As the meeting broke up and preparations began for the larger strategy session, Charlotte found herself walking alongside Victoria toward the conference room where the expanded team would gather. The shared experience of crisis management was creating a different dynamic between them, one based on mutual respect and common purpose rather than polite distance. Charlotte, Victoria said as they walked, I want you to know that your support this morning means more to me than you might realize. I've always hoped that we could find ways to work together constructively, but I wasn't sure if that was something you wanted. Charlotte considered her response carefully. I think we've both been cautious about overstepping boundaries or making assumptions about our relationship. But this situation has shown me that we have more common ground than I realized. We both care about the monarchy's reputation, and we both understand the importance of authentic relationships. As they entered the conference room, where communications staff and other advisors were already gathering, Charlotte realized that this crisis might ultimately strengthen the family in unexpected ways. By working together to manage the immediate challenge, they were building trust and understanding that could serve them well in future situations. The afternoon ahead would be intensive, requiring careful coordination and strategic thinking to minimize damage from the photograph publication. But Charlotte felt more optimistic about the outcome than she had when she first arrived at the palace, confident that their combined efforts would prove more effective than any individual response could have been. The palace conference room filled quickly with key staff members as the crisis management team assembled for what everyone understood would be a crucial strategy session. Communications Director Sarah Hamilton arrived with folders full of draft statements and media analysis, while Digital Engagement Coordinator Michael Chun brought his laptop loaded with social media monitoring tools and public sentiment data. Lord Chancellor Pierce took his customary position at the head of the long mahogany table, with King Edward, Victoria, and Princess Charlotte arranged to his right. The presence of the entire core family at a communications meeting was unusual and signaled to the staff that this situation was being treated with the highest level of seriousness. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for assembling so quickly, Pierce began, his voice carrying the authority earned through decades of managing royal crises. We have a developing media situation that requires immediate strategic coordination. I'll let Communications Director Hamilton brief you on what we're facing. Sarah Hamilton, a former BBC journalist who had joined the palace communications team 5 years earlier, stood and distributed copies of the photographs to everyone present. Her background in investigative reporting had proven invaluable in anticipating how stories would develop and what angles the press might pursue. These images were taken yesterday afternoon and show Her Majesty visiting the private residence of Mrs. Margaret Thornton in Kensington. Mrs. Thornton is currently involved in highly publicized divorce proceedings with her husband, property developer Jonathan Thornton, who has been facing questions about irregularities in his business dealings. The staff members studied the photographs while Hamilton continued her briefing. We have confirmed that at least 3 major publications have been offered these images, and we know that the Daily Mirror is planning to run them in tomorrow's edition. The other outlets are likely waiting to see how the story develops before deciding on their approach. Michael Chin raised his hand to interject. I've been monitoring social media mentions of both Mrs. Thornton and her husband over the past several weeks. There's already significant public interest in their divorce, particularly around the financial aspects. Any royal connection to this story will amplify the attention considerably. Princess Charlotte leaned forward slightly. Michael, what's the general public sentiment regarding the Thornton situation? Are people sympathetic to Mrs. Thornton, or is there skepticism about both parties? It's actually quite mixed, Your Royal Highness. Mrs. Thornton has gained some sympathy as the wrong party, but there's also cynicism about wealthy individuals fighting over assets while ordinary families struggle with basic needs. The royal connection could tip public opinion in either direction, depending on how it's framed. This insight reinforced Charlotte's earlier suggestion about reframing the narrative around universal human values rather than focusing on the specific legal situation. Victoria found herself impressed by Charlotte's strategic thinking and her ability to consider multiple perspectives simultaneously. King Edward addressed the full group. We need to consider not just the immediate media response, but the long-term implications for public trust in the monarchy's political neutrality. Our response must demonstrate that personal relationships don't influence our approach to matters of public policy or legal proceedings. Communications Director Hamilton nodded in agreement. Your Majesty, we've prepared several potential response options. The first is a standard no comment on private matters statement. The second acknowledges the visit while emphasizing its personal nature and lack of connection to any official duties. The third is more proactive and discusses the importance of maintaining friendships during difficult times. Lord Chancellor Pierce gestured for Hamilton to continue with more detail about each option, but Princess Charlotte spoke up before she could proceed. If I may, I'd like to suggest a fourth option that might be more effective than the traditional approaches. Charlotte's voice carried confidence that reflected her growing comfort with strategic planning. What if we acknowledge this as an example of how royal family members remain connected to real people facing real challenges, without discussing the specific legal details? She continued her explanation while the staff members listened attentively. Rather than being defensive about the visit or trying to minimize its significance, we could use this as an opportunity to demonstrate our shared humanity and commitment to supporting the people we serve, even in our private lives. Digital Engagement Coordinator Chin immediately began typing on his laptop. That approach could work very well on social media platforms, Your Royal Highness. Posts about compassion and friendship tend to generate positive engagement, especially when they come from authentic experiences rather than manufactured public relations moments. Victoria felt a surge of gratitude toward Charlotte for her willingness to reframe what could have been a purely negative situation into something potentially positive for the monarchy's reputation. The collaborative approach they were developing felt more natural and effective than the defensive strategies typically employed in similar situations. Charlotte's suggestion has merit, acknowledged Sarah Hamilton, but we need to be extremely careful about the language we use. Any statement that could be interpreted as commenting on ongoing legal proceedings would create additional complications. Lord Chancellor Pierce consulted his notes before responding. We could focus on the general principle of maintaining personal relationships while carefully avoiding any reference to legal matters. The key would be emphasizing that this visit was completely separate from any official royal duties or positions. King Edward stood and walked to the window, a gesture his staff recognized as indicating deep contemplation. The challenge is that whatever approach we take will set a precedent for how we handle similar situations in the future. We need to consider not just this particular incident, but the broader implications for royal privacy and personal relationships. This observation prompted several minutes of discussion about the evolving expectations for royal transparency and the increasing difficulty of maintaining traditional boundaries between public and private life. The social media age had fundamentally changed how royal activities were documented and shared, making complete privacy almost impossible to maintain. Michael Chin shared his screen with the group, showing real-time social media monitoring data. I should mention that there's already some discussion online about yesterday's events. Someone posted a vague reference to seeing interesting visitors in the Kensington area, though they haven't shared specific details or photographs yet. This news added urgency to their decision-making process. If information was already circulating informally, they needed to establish their official position before alternative narratives could take hold in the public discourse. Victoria looked around the table at the assembled team of advisors and family members who were working to protect both her reputation and the monarchy's institutional interests. I want everyone to know how grateful I am for your support and expertise in managing this situation. The visit to my friend was motivated entirely by personal concern for her well-being, and I hope our response can reflect that while acknowledging the unique responsibilities of our position. Princess Charlotte reached over and briefly touched Victoria's hand in a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by the staff members present. The visible unity between the family members would make their public response more credible and effective. I believe we should proceed with the approach Princess Charlotte has outlined, King Edward announced, returning to the table. We'll acknowledge the visit as an expression of personal friendship and support, emphasized that it was completely separate from any official duties, and used this as an opportunity to demonstrate our connection to the real challenges people face in their daily lives. Communications Director Hamilton began making notes for drafting the official statement. We'll need to coordinate the timing of our response carefully. If we release a statement too early, it might draw more attention to the situation than necessary. If we wait too long, we'll appear reactive rather than proactive. The meeting continued for another hour as the team worked through the specific language of their response, timing considerations, and coordination across different media channels. Throughout the process, the collaborative approach between the family members and professional staff created an atmosphere of shared purpose that made the challenging situation feel manageable. As the session concluded and various team members departed to implement their assigned tasks, Victoria realized that this crisis had unexpectedly strengthened her relationships within the royal family and given her new appreciation for the expertise of the palace staff. The challenge ahead would be executing their strategy flawlessly while maintaining the authentic spirit that had inspired their approach. The following morning brought unseasonably bright sunshine to London, a stark contrast to the tension that filled Buckingham Palace as the communications team prepared for the publication of the photographs. Sarah Hamilton arrived at her office before dawn to monitor early online editions of major newspapers, while Michael Chun tracked social media sentiment and emerging conversation themes across multiple platforms. The Daily Mirror's online edition went live at 6 o'clock precisely, featuring the photographs prominently on their homepage alongside the headline, Queen Consort's Secret Visit to Scandal Hit Friend. The article, written by their royal correspondent, speculated about the nature of Victoria's relationship with Margaret Thornton and questioned whether the visit represented inappropriate royal involvement in private legal matters. Within minutes, Hamilton had forwarded the article to King Edward, Victoria, Princess Charlotte, and Lord Chancellor Pierce, along with her preliminary analysis of the publication's tone and likely public response. The article was sensationalized, but not as damaging as it could have been, focusing more on protocol questions than suggesting any actual wrongdoing. By 7 o'clock, the story had been picked up by several other publications and was trending on multiple social media platforms. The palace's prepared statement was released at 7:30, carefully timed to reach morning news programs and shape the day's coverage before alternative narratives could dominate public discourse. Her Majesty the Queen Consort made a private visit yesterday to support a longtime friend during a period of personal difficulty, the statement read. This visit was entirely personal in nature and completely separate from any official royal duties. The Queen Consort values her friendships and believes that supporting others during challenging times reflects the compassion and connection to real people that the monarchy seeks to embody. Princess Charlotte monitored the initial public response from her apartment at Kensington Palace, watching as news outlets began incorporating the palace's statement into their coverage, and social media users started sharing their opinions about the situation. The response was more positive than any of them had anticipated, with many people expressing appreciation for the royal family's humanity and relatability. Victoria spent the morning at Buckingham Palace, maintaining her regular schedule of meetings and engagements while staying informed about media coverage through regular briefings from the communications team. Her private secretary had cleared some non-essential appointments to allow for additional crisis management activities if they became necessary. At 10 o'clock, Lord Chancellor Pierce convened a follow-up meeting to assess the effectiveness of their strategy and adjust their approach based on the morning's developments. The conference room felt significantly less tense than it had the previous day, with early indicators suggesting their response had been well received. The initial public reaction has been largely supportive, reported Sarah Hamilton, consulting her tablet filled with news alerts and social media analytics. Most major outlets have incorporated our statement accurately, and the focus has shifted from criticism to discussion about the balance between royal duty and personal relationships. Michael Chin pulled up social media metrics on the large screen in the conference room. The sentiment analysis shows approximately 65% positive responses, 20% neutral, and only 15% negative. The positive responses are focusing on themes of friendship, compassion, and relatability. Princess Charlotte smiled at these numbers, feeling vindicated in her suggestion to reframe the narrative positively. Are we seeing any particular demographic patterns in the responses? I'm curious whether different age groups are reacting differently to this approach. That's an excellent question, Your Royal Highness, Chen replied, adjusting his display to show demographic breakdowns. Younger audiences are responding very positively to the authenticity aspect, while older demographics appreciate the emphasis on traditional values like loyalty and friendship. The approach seems to be resonating across generational lines. King Edward looked pleased with these results, but remained cautious about declaring victory too early. What about international coverage? We need to consider how this story is being interpreted beyond the UK. Hamilton consulted her international monitoring reports. The coverage in Commonwealth countries has been generally positive, focusing on the human interest aspects rather than protocol concerns. European media has been more analytical, but not particularly critical. American outlets seem most interested in the story as an example of modern royal life. Victoria felt a sense of relief that surprised her with its intensity. The previous 24 hours had been among the most stressful of her time as queen consort, not just because of the potential damage to her reputation, but because of what it might mean for her ability to maintain meaningful personal relationships while fulfilling her royal duties. I think we should also acknowledge the excellent work everyone did in preparing and coordinating our response, Victoria said, looking around the table at the communications team. The collaborative approach made this much more manageable than it would have been otherwise. Lord Chancellor Pierce nodded in agreement. This situation has actually demonstrated some positive developments in our crisis management capabilities. The integration of traditional communication strategies with digital engagement and the inclusion of family perspectives in strategy development proved very effective. As the meeting wound down, Princess Charlotte lingered to speak privately with Victoria while the other attendees dispersed to their respective responsibilities. The shared experience of managing this crisis had created a foundation for more substantive conversation than they had previously enjoyed. Victoria, I wanted to say that I was impressed by how you handled this situation, Charlotte said, her voice carrying genuine respect. It would have been easy to become defensive or to blame others for the complications, but you took responsibility and worked collaboratively to find solutions. Victoria felt moved by this acknowledgement from her stepdaughter. Charlotte, your strategic thinking was invaluable. I don't think we would have arrived at such an effective response without your perspective on reframing the narrative. You helped turn what could have been a purely negative situation into something that actually enhanced public understanding of our humanity. They walked together through the palace corridors toward their respective offices, their conversation continuing in the more relaxed atmosphere that had replaced the crisis tension of the previous day. I've been thinking about what this experience suggests for how we might approach future challenges, Charlotte said. The collaborative approach worked so well that it might be worth institutionalizing rather than reserving for crisis situations. This suggestion intrigued Victoria, who had often felt that the traditional hierarchy of royal decision-making didn't always produce the most effective results. What would that look like in practical terms? Regular strategy sessions that include multiple perspectives, more systematic consideration of different demographic viewpoints when planning public engagements, maybe even some informal feedback mechanisms that help us understand how our actions are being perceived before they become public relations challenges. Victoria recognized the wisdom in these suggestions and also appreciated Charlotte's implicit invitation to ongoing collaboration. I think those are excellent ideas. Would you be interested in working together to develop some specific proposals we could present to your father? As they parted ways to attend to their respective afternoon schedules, both women felt that the previous day's crisis had unexpectedly opened new possibilities for their relationship and for more effective royal family functioning overall. The challenge of managing a potential scandal had revealed strengths and capabilities that might serve them well in future situations. Later that afternoon, Victoria kept her planned engagement at a children's charity luncheon, where several attendees mentioned seeing the morning's news coverage and expressed appreciation for her loyalty to her friend. These personal interactions reinforced the wisdom of their strategic choice to emphasize universal human values rather than focusing on protocol or defensive explanations. The evening news coverage continued to be generally positive, with royal commentators noting that the incident had actually enhanced public perception of the queen consort as someone who maintained meaningful personal relationships despite the constraints of her position. The story was already beginning to fade from front-page prominence, replaced by other political and social news that captured public attention. As Victoria prepared for bed in her private apartments at Buckingham Palace, she reflected on how a moment of personal crisis had led to unexpected strengthening of family relationships and demonstrated the effectiveness of collaborative problem-solving. The experience had taught her valuable lessons about crisis management, but, more importantly, It had shown her new possibilities for authentic connection within the unique constraints of royal life. The photographs that had seemed so threatening 24 hours earlier had become catalysts for positive change, proving that even potentially damaging situations could be transformed through careful strategy and genuine collaboration. The monarchy had not only survived this particular challenge but had emerged stronger and more relatable to the people it served.